I'd been driving for hours, the GPS leading me further and further from civilization. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches tangling together like skeletal fingers. I was supposed to be on a solo retreat, a chance to clear my head after a difficult few months. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd booked a cabin through Airbnb, a secluded spot deep in the woods that promised peace and quiet. The description had sounded idyllic, a cozy cabin with a wood-burning stove, surrounded by towering trees and a babbling brook. But as I turned off the main road and onto the dirt track leading to the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The cabin itself was small, with weathered wooden boards that seemed to absorb the fading light. A lantern hung from the eaves, casting a warm golden glow over the surrounding trees. I pulled up in front of the cabin, feeling a shiver run down my spine as I gazed up at its weathered facade. I grabbed my bags and stepped out into the chill night air, taking a deep breath that filled my lungs with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The forest was quiet, the only sound the distant hooting of an owl. I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with fear as I approached the cabin door. I knocked once, twice, and then turned the handle to push the door open. A warm light spilled out into the darkness and I stepped inside, leaving the chill of the night behind. The cabin was small but cozy. A wood-burning stove dominated one wall, with plush cushions scattered around it. But as I took in the peaceful scene before me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until I noticed the old photograph on the mantelpiece that my unease turned to outright fear. A family of 4 sat in front of the cabin, smiling, happy faces, with a sense of tranquility that seemed almost unnatural. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I gazed at their smiling faces. Something about them seemed off. And then it hit me, a name etched into the corner of the photograph: the Warrens. The cabin's interior was just as cozy as it had seemed from the outside. The wood-burning stove crackled to life, casting a warm glow over the room. I settled onto one of the plush cushions, running my fingers over the soft fabric. It felt like I'd finally found a refuge from the stresses of everyday life. As I began to unpack, I noticed that the cabin seemed shut off from the rest of the world. No cell phone signal, no internet, just the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. I shrugged it off as a blessing in disguise. After all, I'd been feeling overwhelmed for weeks. The isolation was exactly what I needed to clear my head. I spent the next hour setting up the cabin, hanging curtains over the windows and lighting candles around the room. As the darkness deepened outside, the cabin seemed to grow more snug and intimate. I felt like I was curling up in a cocoon of solitude, safe from the world's troubles. But as I settled onto the couch with a book, I began to feel a creeping sense of unease. It wasn't just the darkness outside, it was something inside myself. A nagging feeling that I was being watched, that unblinking eyes were trained on me from the shadows. I spun around, but there was no one there. The cabin seemed to be growing quieter, the crickets chirping slowing to a gentle hum. And then I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like the old wooden floorboards were shifting beneath my feet. It was a soft, almost imperceptible noise, but it sent a shiver down my spine. What was making that sound? And why did it seem so familiar? As night fell, the cabin's atmosphere grew more and more unsettling. At first, it was just small things, a faint scratching sound in the walls, a slight creaking of the wooden floorboards as if someone was walking overhead. I tried to brush it off as mere settling of the old wooden structure, but the noises persisted. The scratching grew louder, sounding like fingernails on wood, and then suddenly stopped. I sat bolt upright, my heart racing with anticipation. Had something just moved? But there was nothing, just silence. I waited for a few moments, but the silence only deepened. It was as if whatever had made the noise was holding its breath, waiting to see if anyone would notice. And then, without warning, the lights flickered once, twice, and died altogether. I was plunged into darkness, surrounded by an oppressive blackness that seemed to press in on me from all sides. The air was thick with tension, heavy with unspoken threats. I strained my ears, but there was no sound, just the distant hooting of owls outside, a mournful call that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, light, cautious steps, as if someone was trying not to be seen. They moved around the cabin, circling back towards me like a predator stalking its prey. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for whatever it was to make its move. But the footsteps stopped outside my door, and an oppressive silence fell over the cabin once more. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I sat in the darkness, trying to make sense of the strange occurrences around me, my eyes landed on an old trunk that had been tucked away in the corner of the room. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, and looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should disturb whatever secrets it might hold, but my curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I made my way over to the trunk, my heart pounding in my chest. As I lifted the lid, a musty smell wafted out, and I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. Inside, I found a collection of artifacts that seemed to be from another era altogether. There were old photographs, yellowed with age, depicting families with names I didn't recognize. There were also strange symbols etched into the walls of the trunk, symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. And then, there was a journal. It belonged to someone named Elijah, and as I flipped through its pages, I discovered a dark legacy that went far beyond anything I could have imagined. Elijah had lived in the cabin over 100 years ago, and his writings revealed a history of madness, murder, and unspeakable horrors. The symbols on the walls seemed to match the ones in the journal, and I began to feel like I was uncovering a dark conspiracy that had been hidden for decades. As I delved deeper into the journal, I discovered that Elijah had made a pact with something ancient and evil, trading his soul for power and knowledge. And now, it seemed like that evil presence was stirring once again. The first night passed with increasingly disturbing events, including unexplained noises and visions. The traveler tried to get some rest, but the cabin seemed to be playing tricks on their mind. They heard whispers in the darkness and saw shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, and it was determined to drive them mad. The traveler tried to focus on their breathing, but their mind kept wandering back to the strange symbols they had found earlier. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and that something was waiting for them just beyond the edge of perception. As the night wore on, the noises grew louder and more intense, until it sounded like someone was pounding on the walls themselves. The traveler's eyes snapped open, and they sat up with a start. The room was silent once more, but they could feel the weight of something malevolent bearing down on them. They knew that they had to get out of there, but as they swung their legs over the side of the bed, they felt a cold hand grasp their ankle. It was then that they saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the light from the bedside lamp. It was tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. The traveler tried to scream, but their voice was frozen in their throat. The figure began to move closer, its presence filling the room with an unspeakable horror. And then everything went black. The traveler's eyes snapped open, and they sat up with a start. They rubbed the sleep from their eyes, thinking it was just a dream, but as they looked around the dark cabin, they realized that they were still alone. It wasn't until they heard the phone ringing that they knew they weren't dreaming. The travelers slowly got out of bed and made their way to the phone, wondering who could be calling them at such an early hour. As they picked up the receiver, a voice on the other end spoke in hushed tones, sending shivers down the traveler's spine. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said, its words dripping with malice. The traveler tried to respond, but their voice caught in their throat. "Who is this?" they managed to stammer, trying to keep their cool. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then the voice spoke again, its tone growing more menacing by the second. "I'm someone who knows what you've done." The traveler's heart began to pound in their chest as they realized that this person must know something about their past, something they had tried to keep hidden. "What are you talking about?" they demanded, trying to keep their voice steady. But before the voice could respond, it suddenly went dead. The traveler was left standing there, frozen in fear, wondering what kind of person would make a phone call like that. As they stood there, trying to process what had just happened, the cabin around them began to feel colder and more oppressive. It was as if the very walls were closing in on them, trapping them in a web of terror. The traveler knew they had to get out of there, but as they turned to leave, they realized that their door was no longer where they had left it. It seemed to have moved, as if some unseen force had shifted it. A chill ran down the traveler's spine as they realized that they were trapped, with no escape from whatever horrors lay ahead. As the traveler frantically searched for an exit, their eyes landed on a small, hidden compartment in the wall. It was cleverly concealed, but the desperation that had taken over the traveler's mind allowed them to spot it. With shaking hands, they opened the compartment and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. The cover was old and cracked, with strange symbols etched into the surface. As they opened the book, they were met with yellowed pages filled with handwritten entries. The writer's handwriting was spidery and uneven, but the words themselves told a story of unspeakable horror. The traveler's eyes widened as they read through the journal, their mind reeling from the atrocities described within. The entries spoke of an ancient cult that had once occupied the cabin, one that had made pacts with dark forces to satiate their twisted desires. They wrote of human sacrifices, ritualistic ceremonies, and unspeakable rituals performed in the dead of night. The traveler felt a chill run down their spine as they read through the journal, their minds struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of the horrors described. As they turned the pages, they came across a passage that seemed to be written specifically for them. "You have arrived at the end of the line," it read. "The others before you were consumed by the very darkness they sought to harness. You will not be different." The traveler felt a presence behind them and spun around, but there was no one there. The cabin was silent once more, except for the sound of their own ragged breathing. They knew then that they had to get out of there, but as they tried to leave, they realized that the door had shifted again. This time it seemed to be locked in place, trapping them inside. As the traveler frantically searched for an exit, their eyes landed on a strange symbol etched into the wall. It seemed to be pulsing with a malevolent energy, as if it was alive and watching them. The symbol was unlike anything the traveler had ever seen before. It was as if someone had taken all the darkest corners of human experience and condensed them into this one twisted image. The air around it seemed to distort and ripple, like the surface of a pond hit by a stone. The traveler could feel the energy emanating from the symbol, a cold, dark power that seeped into their bones and made their skin crawl. They knew they had to get away from it, but their feet seemed rooted to the spot. As they gazed at the symbol, they began to notice strange things. The walls around them seemed to be shifting and twisting, like they were made of some kind of living, breathing material. The air was thick with an unseen presence, a malevolent force that watched them with cold, calculating eyes. The traveler's heart was racing now, their breath coming in short gasps. They knew they had to get out of there, but the symbol seemed to be drawing them in, like a moth to a flame. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the symbol vanished. The wall returned to its normal state, and the air was still once more. But the traveler knew that nothing would ever be the same again. They had seen something that was not of this world, something that lurked just beyond the edge of reality, and they knew that they would never be able to escape its influence. As the night wore on, the traveler's grip on reality began to slip. The cabin seemed to be closing in around them, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards made them jump, every groan of the wind outside making them think it was the cabin itself speaking to them in a voice that sent shivers down their spine. They tried to focus on the journal, but the words blurred together on the page, and they couldn't seem to recall what they were supposed to be writing about. The symbol on the wall seemed to be pulsing with an otherworldly energy, drawing them in with an irresistible force. They felt themselves being pulled deeper into its depths, further and further from the world of rational thought. The lines between reality and madness began to blur, and the traveler found themselves questioning what was real and what was just a product of their own fevered imagination. They stumbled through the cabin, trying to find some semblance of order in the chaos that surrounded them. But every door they opened led only to more questions, more terrors. The wind howled outside like a chorus of lost souls, and the traveler knew they were not alone. They were being watched, stalked by forces that lurked just beyond the edge of perception. And then, suddenly, everything went black. The traveler collapsed to the floor, their vision spinning with stars. When they came to, they were lying on a cold stone floor, surrounded by candles that cast eerie shadows on the walls. They knew deep down that they had crossed some kind of threshold, entered a realm where the laws of sanity no longer applied. And yet, even as they realized this, they couldn't bring themselves to care. The madness was too all-consuming, too intoxicating. They rose to their feet, feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders. And then, with a sense of inevitability, they began to walk. As the traveler walked, they began to feel like they were being watched. Every step they took seemed to be anticipated by some unseen force, as if they were being herded towards a destination that only the presence knew. The air seemed to thicken with an invisible weight, making it hard for them to breathe. They could feel eyes upon them, boring into their skin like cold, calculating instruments. But whenever they tried to look around, there was no one there. The candles on the walls cast flickering shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, making it impossible for the traveler to discern any shape or form. The wind outside died down, and an oppressive silence fell over the cabin. It was as if the very presence itself was holding its breath, waiting for the traveler to make their next move. The traveler's heart was racing now, their senses on high alert. They tried to shake off the feeling of being stalked, but it only seemed to intensify. Every creak of the floorboards made them jump, every whisper of the wind outside making them spin around, expecting to see some figure lurking just out of sight. And then suddenly they heard their own name. It was a low, raspy voice, barely audible over the sound of their own heartbeat. The traveler spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to be coming from all around them, echoing off the walls. "Welcome," it said. "We've been waiting for you." As the traveler stumbled through the darkness, they began to notice a faint rustling in the underbrush. At first, they thought it was just the wind or a stray animal, But then they saw it, a trail of blood-soaked footprints leading deeper into the woods. The travelers' hearts sank as they realized that they were not alone. They quickened their pace, but the prints only grew larger and more frequent, until it seemed like an entire army was marching through the forest. Suddenly, the trees parted to reveal a clearing, and in the center of it stood a gruesome sight. A group of figures, their bodies twisted and contorted in unnatural positions, as if they had been ripped apart by some unseen force. The traveler's mind recoiled in horror as they took in the sheer scale of the carnage. There were dozens of bodies, each one more brutally mutilated than the last. It seemed like a scene from a nightmare, but it was all too real. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay, and the traveler could feel the weight of it bearing down on them. They knew they had to get out of there, but their legs seemed rooted to the spot. As they stood frozen in terror, the wind began to pick up, and the figures started to stir. The travelers' eyes widened as they realized that they were not alone in the forest. They were surrounded by an army of the damned. When morning finally arrived, the traveler was left shaken and wondering if they had survived the night or were consumed by it. They slowly opened their eyes to find themselves back in the cabin, but everything seemed different. The walls no longer seemed to be closing in on them, and the air felt cleaner. The candles were still lit, but they cast a warm, gentle glow instead of the eerie shadows they had created before. The travelers sat up with a start, their hearts still racing from the events of the night before. They looked around the cabin, taking in the familiar sights and sounds, but something was off. The furniture seemed slightly rearranged, and the fireplace was now lit, crackling with a warm fire. The traveler's mind reeled as they tried to piece together what had happened. Had it all been just a dream, or had they really experienced the horrors of the night before? They stumbled out of the cabin, into the bright sunlight, feeling like they were emerging from a nightmare. The forest was quiet and still, with no signs of the carnage they had seen the night before. The traveler took a deep breath, feeling the warm sun on their face, and wondered if they would ever be able to shake off the feeling of being stalked by something malevolent. They knew they had to keep moving to find help and safety. But as they turned to leave, they caught a glimpse of themselves in a nearby puddle. Their eyes were sunken, their skin pale, and their hair was disheveled. The traveler's heart skipped a beat as they realized that something was very wrong.